Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Classifying Your Products for Importing and Exporting. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dave Noah and I'm president of Shipping Solutions. Since 1995, our export documentation and compliance software has helped thousands of successful exporters more efficiently generate accurate export documents and stay compliant with import-export regulations. To help educate our customers and the wider international trade community, we regularly host free webinars like this one on various aspects of international trade. Today we are very lucky to have Robert Imbriani as our speaker. Bob has been in the transportation and logistics field for more than 5 decades. He's held various senior executive positions with major U.S. customs brokers and freight forwarders. He's currently Executive Vice President International for Team Worldwide and President of Team Ocean Services, Inc., Team International Trade Services, and Team Canada. Bob's a well-known speaker and educator in the areas of trade compliance, contract negotiations, transportation, logistics and supply chain solutions, customs brokerage, trade development, and financial services. And he has been a frequent presenter for us on these webinars, and we're very happy and excited to have him back.
Okay, welcome everybody to today's program. We're going to be covering all of the aspects of classification under the U.S. Harmonized System, and we'll be addressing the differences between use of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule and the Harmonized Schedule B. We'll talk about the importance of classification for both importers and exporters. And classification is important whether you're an importer or an exporter, because if we look at the import side, it is a major element of compliance on import. Import is a little different than export in that the import operation is very much tied to the compliance. And one of the major elements of import compliance is the proper classification of the goods that are entering the U.S. Classification will determine the duty rates and even in many cases the jurisdiction of other government agency or partner government agencies over that import. On both the import and export side, it is gathering of statistical information for the Census Bureau. And on the export side, the classification is not really for the client overseas, although it can assist them with entering the goods into their country. It is a major element of the filing of the electronic export information. And even on the export side, it's an element that can lead to fines and penalties if there's no reasonable effort to properly classify the goods and to present that proper classification as part of your filing of the EEI. It is also important for anyone who is classifying and determining their goods to be eligible under any of our free trade agreements. The rules of origin for our free trade agreements are based very often on the transformation of material into the final product based on the classification of the material versus the classification of the final good, and does the material go through an acceptable transformation on its own, and does it require in some cases what's called regional value content. You know, an exporter can also assist the buyer who's the import with classification, in that we'll talk about the elements of a classification that are consistent with every version or every country that uses the harmonized system. I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a shortcut here, but every country in the world has traditionally had a system for classifying or identifying goods coming into their country. This is generally to assess taxes, as they were originally called. I think eventually they called taxes duty so they could collect duty and taxes. But the U.S. was no different. We had what was called a tariff schedule of the U.S. And since the U.S. likes acronyms, it was referred to as the TSUS. This was developed by the U.S. International Trade Commission and U.S. Customs Service, which was part of the Treasury Department. And it was used to classify goods to determine the tax rate on goods coming into the U.S. They realized that it was also a source to gather trade statistics. So they started using the customs entry, today the 7501, to gather information as to what goods are coming into the U.S. in what quantities, dollar values, from which countries. They quickly realized, well, that's only half the trade statistics. We need information on what's being exported from the U.S. So they, instead of using the harmonized tariff schedule of the U.S. for import and export, they created a version of the harmonized tariff that would be used for export reporting. And when they did this, they looked at the harmonized tariff schedule as being the first version. So that became Schedule A. And the modified version that was used for gathering export statistical information was Schedule B. So if you've ever wondered why we call it the Schedule B, is because the harmonized tariff came first. And as trade went on globally and global trade expanded, countries realized that having a more consistent classification system would have a benefit. It would allow for the negotiation of trade agreements. If you handle goods this way, we'll handle goods that way too. But how do you determine the definition of the goods unless you have a consistent classification system? So here's where I'll take the shortcut. Through various trade organizations, the World Trade Organization, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and so forth, they proposed a global system that would be called the Harmonized System. And they realized that any harmonized system would have to have some flexibility. So they determined that they would create a system where a certain portion of the classification would be consistent with every country who utilized it, but leaving a portion of the classification to be unique to a country's needs. And in a minute, we'll talk about how that could also be used within a country for maybe the specific needs of an agency or certain gathering of information that would be unique to that country or that agency within the country. The U.S. was one of the first 10 nations to adopt the harmonized system, and we adopted the harmonized system in 1988. It is an internationally recognized core system to uniformly classify goods that are traded internationally. The structure is the same to a certain level. There will be sections, chapters, headings, subheadings, and so forth. And that structure and the definition and rules within that structure will be the same for every country who utilizes the harmonized system. Today, we have almost 140 countries who utilize the harmonized system. It is officially 21 sections with 97 chapters. The sections are the broadest definitions, and then the chapters are dispersed within the section to cover the items defined in those sections. They are not evenly dispersed. You will have some sections that have 3 or 4 chapters, some have 2, and others may have 5 or 6. Chapter 77 is reserved for future use and has not yet been used. Anything beyond the 21 sections and the 97 chapters is specific to a country. Chapters 98, 99 would fall into a section 22 if a country elects to do so. And the U.S. has elected in our 2 versions of the system to use section 22. The structure is a 10-digit numbering system of which the first 6 digits are harmonized. Harmonized means the definition and the corresponding rules are the same for every version of the harmonized system. The last 4 are country specific. A country can look to not use the last 4 and they would be all zeros, or they can use them to any level to gather additional information that they feel is necessary. No changes can be made to the structure up to the first 6 digits unless the majority of the countries who utilize the system agree. We talked about that prior to the harmonized system, we had the tariff schedule of the US, and it was known as Schedule A, and it was related to the US International Trade Commission, US Customs Service, and the Treasury Department. A little known fact is that for the first 125 years of the US existence, the federal government was funded 100% by US customs duties and so forth. That income tax only came in the late 20s and so forth. Prior to that, it was funded by customs. Then we had the Schedule B, which was for export purposes. And we'll talk about the difference in the two. Now, when the US adopted the harmonized system, we could have just adopted the harmonized system of the US. We elected not to do so. We elected the harmonized tariff of the United States and the harmonized Schedule B. So why do we have two systems, and how do we determine which one we use? Well, the concept, since the import classification affects not only statistical information, but all information, they realized that U.S. Customs, the Trade Commission, would want more detail and more ability to refine the identification of goods coming in than maybe we need on export. So that was their justification for having two systems. Now, which system do you use? For import into the United States and for determining eligibility under U.S. free trade agreements, you must use the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. For export, you can use the Harmonized Schedule B, or you can use the Harmonized Tariff Schedule supplemented by the Schedule B. And what we mean by supplemented relates to two areas. That there are some harmonized tariff classifications that will not be accepted through the ACE system to file the electronic export information. It'll say that number doesn't exist. There aren't too many, but there are a few. And we would have to reclassify those items to the Schedule B number. The vast majority of harmonized tariff classifications are accepted by the system to file the EEI. The other reason is when we adopted the harmonized tariff, we had a Section 22 and additional chapters 98 and 99. Chapter 98 are special classifications for import for goods being returned to the U.S. duty-free, either U.S. goods returned without being enhanced in value outside of the U.S., or goods previously exported from the U.S. without being enhanced in value. Chapter 99 are special temporary duty provisions, and today can reflect a lot of the additional tariffs that we all have heard about over recent months. The Harmonized Schedule B has a Section 22, but only a Chapter 98. And Chapter 98 has a couple of limited classifications, about 10 in total, for certain exports from the U.S. One of the most common is goods exported after repair. There is a special Harmonized Schedule B classification in Chapter 98 of the Schedule B that you need to use for goods being exported after repair, and you only show the value of the repair. That's why we say if you're using the harmonized tariff schedule for export, there may be still some need to refer to the harmonized Schedule B. If you only export, you'd use the Schedule B. If you only import, you must use the harmonized tariff. If you import and export, you can either use both, Schedule B for export, harmonized tariff for import, or the harmonized tariff supplemented by the Schedule B. Just to give you some information about the classification process, that to classify goods properly, you need to know the product and have technical information on the product. Every product will require some level of technical information. So we're going to use something very simple, a pair of pliers. And someone says we're importing pliers or exporting pliers, we need a harmonized number. Sounds simple enough. We're going to look at the sections and go to the section that seems to cover tools. And we find chapter 82, which covers tools, implements, cutlery. Sounds like a chapter that should cover pliers. So our first two digits of the harmonized number are the chapter. The first four digits, and I'm not going to say the next two, but the first four constitute the major heading or the heading. This technically is the third heading in the 82nd chapter. There may not be two headings in between, but technically it's the third heading of the 82nd chapter. This narrows it down a little bit further to files, rasp, pliers. Looks like we're on the right track. You can look at classification sometimes as a funnel. The top of the funnel covers a lot, and as it goes down the funnel, it narrows it down. It makes it more specific. Well, the classification process is the same. The sections cover a lot. Chapters make it a little more specific, headings more so, subheadings, and so on. Now, the next level of the classification is what's called the subheading. And again, this is the first six digits. It's the 20th subheading in the third heading of the 82nd chapter. Now, again, there may not be subheadings in between, or there may be, but technically the 20th subheading in the third heading of the 82nd chapter. Now it covers specifically pliers, pincers, tweezers. Now, if we classify this in any country or any version of the harmonized system, we should get the same first six digits because the definitions in every version to this level are the same. Anything beyond this can now be country, or in our case, agency specific. The first four digits on the import side are called the tariff classification level. So the first set of 8 digits is the tariff classification level, because on the import side, your rate of duty, your standard rate of duty, or the special rate of duty, or even the column 2 level rate of duty is set at the that applies. Now, in this case, on import, they wanted to know if these were slip joint pliers or not. So that's a piece of technical information we needed. Without a picture or that information, we could not properly classify it. So if a simple pair of pliers requires some technical detail, you can imagine other products may require a much higher level of technical information. On the export side, this would just be considered a statistical level. And then the full digit classification for import would be 8203 20 60 30. And this, now I show on the top two classifications. Under the harmonized system, it's 8203 20 60 30. Under the harmonized schedule B, it's 8203 25,000. For import, you must use the 60/30. For export, you can use the 5,000 or the 60/30 if it's acceptable in the EEI filing. Now, what this points out is on the import side, they may have wanted to have statistical information about slip joint versus non-slip joint pliers, maybe vary the rate of duty for different reasons on it, where the export side reported it in a much broader definition. But it is an example of how the harmonized number can be different. When you're dealing internationally and you provide the US harmonized number to your customer overseas, almost always those last 4 digits are going to be different because their version of the harmonized system is based on their country's need for certain information and other factors. For your filing of the import entry, or the EEI filing, you must classify it based on the U.S. system with any U.S. rules of interpretation or rulings that would apply. So what is classification? Classification is the legal analysis by which goods entering into the U.S. or being exported are classified. And we need two basic sets of information. Identify the article in simple terms and for tariff purposes. Another way to say this is the proper shipping name and the essential characteristics of the product, meaning what is the basic product. So let's use something different. Men's shirts. So men's shirts is a proper shipping name. Need to know things like, is it 100% cotton, 100% wool, 50% cotton, 50% polyester, and so forth. So we need that level of technical information where we describe the goods in general terms, but have details that would affect the classification. If we had an electric motor may be a proper shipping name, but is it AC/DC, reversible or not? What is the wattage? Something like aircraft parts would not be an acceptable term because that could be almost anything under the sun. We would need maybe three levels: aircraft part, the description of the part, and some technical details on the part itself. When you classify, there are additional rules that you have to look at. Each section and chapter within the harmonized system will have section notes and chapter notes. These are notes in each section or chapter that give you guidance on how to classify. Many times they'll say this chapter or this section does not cover certain things because they realize the description might lead you to say, I should look in this section or chapter and guide you away in classifying something in that chapter or section. Now, there's going to be global notes, section and chapter notes, that are the same in every version of the harmonized system. However, the US always makes life a little more complicated, and you will find section and chapter notes. And we have to be aware of those US notes when classifying here in the US. Now, if we have a structure that's very similar to a certain level or exactly the same to a certain level globally, and we don't have rules in how to classify, we're still not going to have a consistent system. So part of the harmonized system includes what are called general rules of interpretation. It kind of sets the hierarchy of how you classify goods. There will be 6 general rules of interpretation that are global, but again, the US will have some rules of interpretation unique to the US. We need technical support. It's always good to have a classification team, someone that understands the classification system and an expert in the product. You may also have reference material, technical brochures, chemical dictionaries, electronic information, other things like that, and set up a procedure of a hierarchy. If you cannot classify internally, who do you go to next? Maybe your custom broker, an outside consultant, and even when do you go to the government directly to have them help classify or provide? The tariff is in many cases set up with a system of progression. And what we mean by that, if we were to look at Chapter 47, we have wood pulp. Chapter 48 is paper and paperboard. And if we think about it, wood pulp turns into paper, paperboard. Then we have Chapter 49, which are printed book newspapers. The pulp turns into paper, paper turns into printed books. As the chapters go up, and even within chapters, many times they build on the previous definitions. The 6 general rules of interpretation, as I mentioned, set the hierarchy for classification. They are the same for the harmonized tariff as the harmonized Schedule B. So as we go through these, they apply to both. You can find the full text of the Harmonized General Rules of Interpretation in the U.S. Harmonized Tariff, the General Notes section. And we'll kind of encapsulate these a little bit for the sake of time, but Rule 1 is one of the most important rules. And I sometimes say it's the rule people love to hate, because Rule 1 says that if an item is provided for in the form in which you are looking to classify it, that's how you have to classify it. And this refers to something like if we have a bolt and the bolt is for a machine, it's not a machine part, it's a bolt, and we have to classify it as a bolt. If we have a bearing, bearings are provided for. So it's not an aircraft part, it's a bearing, and we have to classify it based on the bearing. Now, the reason I say people love to hate this, you have an invoice with 5 or 6 line items. They're all aircraft parts. So you want to use one classification, aircraft parts. But applying Rule 1, you could have 6 separate harmonized classifications. So what you thought was 1 has turned into 6 by applying Rule 1. Now, that's not always the case, but it's where we start the classification process. We first look to see if it's provided for as what it is, and only when it's not can we look and classify it in a different direction. Now, Rule 2 can get complicated. It talks about items that are incomplete, disassembled, unfinished, but have the essential classification of the finished item. If it is sold as a single item, priced as a single item, on an invoice as a single item, and we determine that it has the primary characteristic of the finished item, we classify it as the finished item. The characteristic might be involved function, bulk, quantity, weight, value, the role of the material or the goods in being a finished item. We could come up with a lot of complicated examples, but we'll use a simple one. If you've ever seen a bicycle that's shipped, it's not fully assembled and it's in a very thin box. It's not quite as disassembled as this picture shows, but there's a reason for it. If it's sold as one man's mountain bike, part number price, even though it's not assembled, we classify it as a bicycle. Maybe we take away a certain part like the pedal or the seat or something of that nature, but we're still selling it as a bike, it would be a bicycle. If we took away the chassis or the frame, then we would have to look at it as parts because it no longer has the essential characteristic of a bicycle. Now, Rule 2 and the other rules send us back to Rule 1. First, we looked at it as a bicycle. So we went to Rule 1, a bicycle is provided for, they're provided for. Now we have to look at it as parts, and we have to look at each part individually and apply Rule 1. And if we really went into this, I could give you the harmonized classifications, but it's an interesting one because if we go to the chapter that covers bicycles and bicycle parts, we will be able to classify a good portion of the parts under that chapter and heading and subheading because there will be certain bicycle parts spelled out. There is a classification bicycle parts other, and we have a tendency then to throw whatever's left over into that. But Rule 1 says we cannot. We have to look at each of these parts to see if they're provided for. And what we would find, the chain, although not provided in the chapter for bicycle, is in a completely different chapter under articles of iron or steel, and it's covered by chains of a type used in a bicycle. The tires are in a third chapter under pneumatic tires of a type used in a bicycle. So it's a good example of how we have to look at a product different ways, but always be applying that Rule 1. Rule 2 talks about when we have something that is a mixture of two things. We have a clock radio. Is it a clock or a radio? How do we classify that? Now, Rule 3 has a couple of elements to it. If we can classify something under more than one classification, the most specific classification has to apply. We have a men's shaver with pop-up trimmer. If we look at 8467, it's electromechanical tools for working in the hand. Close. If we go to 8509, we have electromechanical domestic appliance, closer. But if we went one more, we have shavers and hair clippers. We have to use shavers and hair clippers. If we have a mixture of an item, we have to try to determine the primary characteristic. We're selling a vase with a base and some flowers. We would have to determine if this is sold as one item, is it primarily a vase, a wooden platform, or some artificial flowers? I think we might agree that it's a vase, and that would be the primary characteristic, and we would classify it as that. If we have something that we sell as a set, packaged together, invoiced as one, and let's say it's a bubble pack with a flashlight in it, a warning light, a battery, and 2 bulbs. Each would have their own harmonized classification, but it's packaged together, sold as one item. Therefore, the essential characteristic is a flashlight, and we would sell it at that. Now, if we had 4 line items, we have 10 flashlights, 10 warning modules, 10 batteries, and 20 bulbs. It would make up 10 sets, but since it's invoiced separately, priced separately, we would have to classify it separately. This could also be a concept with a repair kit. If you sell an overhaul kit and you sell it as a kit and it has all the items to change a gasket and so forth, maybe the gasket itself, a little bit of gasket cement, a little sandpaper to smooth it out, maybe 2 new lockdown screws, but you sell it as a set, you would classify it as a set and it would be the gasket. If someone though came and said, I need 1 gasket, 2 screws, a little bit of sandpaper and some gasket cement, they would all have to be classified separately because then it's not a kit, they're separate items. If nothing dominates, you take the highest numeric classification. We have a mixture of barley and oats for a horse feed. We're going to say the volume of the barley and oats are equal. The value is equal. There is no barley and oats classification for horse feed. We classify both and take the highest numeric classification, which would be 1004. Only when we get to Rule 4, if we cannot classify by applying rules 1, 2, and 3, and the elements of 2 and 3 send us to a great extent back to 1, we now can look at classifying something based on what it is most akin to or under the famous other. So many people jump to a classification that says other. We can only use that after we cannot apply those first 3 rules. Now, an example of this is we bring in a window for a machine. It's a plastic window, a gasket around it, 2 holes drilled in it. Would that be more like an article of plastic or part of the machine? In that form, I would say it's part of the machine. If we brought in 4-inch squares of plastic that we had to round the edges, put a gasket on and drill the holes, that would not be part of the machine. That would be more akin to articles of plastic based on the thickness and the type of plastic and so forth. Rule 5, things get a little simpler. If something comes in with dedicated packaging, a camera in a camera case, a guitar in a guitar case, a chainsaw in a chainsaw case, a gun in a gun case, so forth and so on. As long as they come in together, invoiced as a single item, and the value and use is reasonable for the item, you would classify it only as the item, not the case. If they came in separately, you'd have to classify them separately. Now, there's also that reasonableness of the value and the intent that it's primarily used for that purpose. You could take the guitar out of the guitar case or something, use it for something else, but it's reasonable to believe they would stay together. However, if we have something that the value or the use is separate, we'd have to classify them separate. If we had a crystal decanter worth $600 with $12 worth of brandy in it, it's not reasonable you're going to throw the decanter away when the brandy's gone. So we would have to classify both. Same thing with a crystal vase with $3 worth of artificial flowers in it. This also applies to general packaging. Although cardboard packaging and so forth could be reused, it's reasonable to think that it is for the use of the item. The value will be dutiable on the import side, but it doesn't get classified separately. Rule 6 tells us that after we've gone through rules 1 to 5 and we've classified it to the subheading level, we continue to apply those rules until we get the full 10-digit classification. One of the things to realize is when you look at the harmonized system, you might initially say this is complicated. But if you take a moment to analyze it, you're going to see that the chapters begin their definition closest to the left-hand margin. So here we have 7304. What you do is you only read chapter descriptions and compare at that level. Then when you found what you believe to be correct, you move to the right to the next indentation and you only compare at that level. So you're really taking a lot of the text out and only comparing at the same level, the chapter, the headings, subheadings, and you narrow it down until you get the full 10-digit classification. Now, I mentioned that in addition to the 6 general rules of interpretation, we have the U.S. rules of interpretation. The U.S. rules of interpretation only apply to the U.S., and they generally revolve around that you may be able to classify something in the U.S. based on its intended use after import or its use prior to import into the U.S. It's a complicated rule and many times is only used when asking for a binding ruling from U.S. Customs and Border Protection. But it can mean that we'll classify something significantly different in the U.S. than they might classify it in another country. Although the harmonized system is the same structure to the 6 digits, it's always based on rulings and interpretations in the country where it's being classified. So, best internal practices for a company. You should have written procedures on your classification. You should create a classification team that is a combination of disciplines. Someone who understands the structure and use of the harmonized system and a technical person. We've seen companies where they can find that in one individual. We have some chemical and pharmaceutical companies that a chemist is their lead person to classify goods. They train them on the harmonized system, and they're the expert in the product to begin with. You need to set a hierarchy for your classification. If you cannot self-classify or determine if your classification is correct, who do you go to? Your custom broker, freight forwarder? Do you go to a consultant? And at what point do you go to a government agency for a ruling? You need to maintain a database that once you classify, it should become part of a parts database so that you don't reclassify every time and so that people use the same classifications. You don't want different parts of your company using different classifications for the same product. Provide periodic training to your staff. Review your classifications on a regular basis. The U.S. Harmonized System is updated twice a year in January and July. Right now, you would be using the January 2025 version of the harmonized tariff or the Schedule B. After July 1st, it'll be the July version. Know how to apply for rulings or interpretations. These are some helpful links, and we're not over with the presentation. I know we went through those fairly quickly. What I wanted to do was some time to go through a couple of things. If you go into the harmonized system, in the general section, you will have your general notes and rules of interpretation. A couple of areas here that are important is when they come out with a new version of the harmonized system, or sometimes while the version is already in force, they put in a change record where they'll tell you what harmonized numbers or modifications may have taken place and the date that they took place. This version did not have any classification changes, but had some note changes. So when you're looking to recheck your classifications when the system is updated, you can go to this change section and see if there's any changes to the chapters and headings and so forth that you're using. I also wanted to use it for one other thing. This is section 16, and we'll see that we have our section notes. And the things like this section does not cover. And it'll go through various notes related to classifying in this section. Then we'll have the chapter notes. So that was for the whole section, which has 2 chapters. This is for specifically chapter 84 in that section. And if we scroll down, we watch for additional US notes. So when we talk about additional US notes, that's how you might find them. And I know this is a little different than some of our programs where we're going in and out of sites, but I think there's value to this. There's a tool called, it's officially called the Customs Ruling Online Search System. Most people call it CROSS. The system of applying for U.S. Customs and Border Protection to provide a binding ruling on classification is a process that's electronic. You can go to U.S. Customs and Border Protection and have them classify goods for you. You need to provide all of the technical detail on the product and maybe even guidance to how you think it should be classified. These are put in a searchable database that you can access. You can access it by company or description. I put in bendable ballpoint pens and I come up with a ruling for tariff classification of bendable ballpoint pens. If you classify on this note here, this was done by U.S. Customs commodity specialists in New York, and you will actually get a copy of the letter from Customs to whoever requested it, describing the goods and saying why they classified it a certain way. Now, this ruling is only for that company and their ballpoint pens. However, if you read this and say, that's what I have, you can use that to help support your internal classification. Now, of course, you have to watch here. This was done 20 years ago. So this specific one, the number or the description may have changed some in the last 4 digits. And you can sometimes find that by clicking on the harmonized number, and it'll bring you to a way that you can check to see if it's still valid or not. Another tool that can be valuable, it's designed specifically for export, but can help you on import. And it's called the Schedule B search engine. And this is much more of a search engine. And you need to apply your rules of interpretation. But I'm going to put in bearings, and it'll start asking me questions. It appears not to be working at the moment, but it is a good site. I do recommend it. And it will go through and ask you what type of bearings and so forth, and it'll narrow it down and give you a classification under the Harmonized Schedule B. So it will be a classification under the Harmonized Schedule B, which is for export, but you can then take that classification, refer to the harmonized tariff, and see if the harmonized number is the same or what adjustment you have to make to the last four digits to get the harmonized tariff number. So those are just two tools that can be helpful in trying to classify something. The customs ruling online search system and the Schedule B search engine. They are not absolute tools, but they help you guide based on information to what you feel is the appropriate classification. One of the things to remember that a number of years ago, they introduced what was called the Customs Mod Act, the Customs Modernization Act. It was specifically put in place to allow customs entries to be electronic. It also had attached to it the original NAFTA bill. But it made one major change for import, that prior to the Mod Act, it was legally U.S. Customs responsibility to properly classify the goods and value them for import. Under the Mod Act, it became the legal responsibility of the importer of record to classify the goods and value the goods for import. So on the import side, there is a legal responsibility of the importer of record. And on the export side, the export rules require that the USPPI either file the proper harmonized number or provide the proper harmonized number to the agent who's filing on their behalf, or even the agent who's filing on behalf of the buyer in a routed transaction. I know this is a very quick overview of the classification process. Hopefully there were some elements that are helpful, but one thought to leave you with, there's a joke in the New York City area. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. The only way to get good or better at classification is to work the system, to constantly be classifying, reading the rules of interpretation, the section notes, chapter notes, even looking up binding rulings and using other sources to see how customs or other agencies might look at the classification of certain goods. So I tried to leave some time. We have maybe 7 to 10 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Bob. We do have a few questions. Can you go back to this help slide that listed some additional resources? I think, yeah. And if we could leave that up on the screen here for a couple minutes so that people can review that and copy down some addresses there. We'll also have some links on a resources page that we will create for this this webinar, as well as we'll be sending out recording so you can look at the recording and find this slide again. But here it is for people to review. One question we have is, what are the implications if the goods are misclassified?
Let's look at import first. U.S. Customs looks at that as a major element, not because of the statistical information that they gather from it, but we mentioned that it is going to relate to the rate of duty and other government agency rules that may apply to that product. Customs may look at that in two ways. First and foremost, did you misclassify it on purpose to avoid duty or to get a lower rate of duty or avoid the review by a certain government agency? If it's ruled to be intentional, there can be significant fines and penalties over and above paying what duties were due plus interest. In severe cases, you could be charged criminally. Now, even if there was no intent, they may look at it and say, did you exercise reasonable care to classify it? Or did you just kind of haphazardly classify it? They still can assess penalties in those cases where you did not exercise a reasonable effort to classify it properly. On the export side, it's even a little more specific, that if you misclassify in filing the EEI, they can look at that as a major error in classification, and it could start with a $10,000 fine, which is the standard for a misfiling. And if you file late, it's $1,100 a day. If you don't file at all or deceptively file, inaccurately file, it's $10,000 per occurrence. Now, they do many times, for the first few times this happens, mitigate it down to maybe a few $100s, but there are fines and penalties on both sides, with, in some cases, more severe penalties on the import side. But if you misclassify it for export to try to justify an improper export control classification number, that could be looked as criminal intent as well.
If your classification came from a customs broker and is incorrect or questioned, is the broker responsible, or would the company that's importing the goods be responsible for that wrong classification?
If a broker misclassifies it, in most all cases, it starts that the importer of record is responsible. A custom broker works under a power of attorney, acting as legal agent of the importer of record. The importer of record is responsible for classification. So if they allowed and agreed to the broker's classification, they are responsible. Now, if the broker, the custom broker, and this would apply to a freight forwarder as well, disregards the classification that the importer gave them, if they on their own change the classification or something similar to that, then the importer can shift that liability to the broker if they can prove the broker did that without the knowledge, permission, or agreement of the importer of record.
How long does it take to obtain a customs binding ruling?
Good question, and not such a good answer. We've seen them come back in around 30 days, and we've seen them come back in 6 or 7 months. A lot has to do with what you're asking to classify. If it's something that is very simple, easy, that it's something customs has seen before, you provide all the proper technical data on the product, it'll be 30 to 60 days. However, many times the reason you're going for a binding ruling is there a question. Should it be this? Should it be that? How should we classify it? What is some of the technical aspects of it? And that's what can take some binding rulings a much longer period of time, because customs has to review it. They've been known to go to universities for information, to the Army Corps of Engineers, to other resources, back to the importer, and so forth. So it really depends on how much information you can provide up front and how complicated the product is for classification. And as I said, many times you're not going to go for a binding ruling unless it's something that's more difficult to classify. So you can anticipate a longer period of time. But we start out with a minimum of 30 to 60 days minimum.
And then our last question, and then we'll have some final words. And keep in mind that because I know there are a lot of questions, and we will work with Bob to try to find a time we can host an Ask Me Anything session on this topic so we can spend more time answering questions. But our last question for today is, if you discover that an item has been misclassified, what should you do?
Okay, on the import side, you would do a voluntary disclosure to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And how that affects things will depend on how did it affect the duty and a number of other factors. And you would continue then to use that classification going forward. On the export side, it would depend on how off your classification was. But in many cases on the export side, you would just begin to use the proper classification going forward and not necessarily try to correct the EEI filings from the past. So it's more of a process on the import side to do a voluntary disclosure, an adjustment to your entries, where the export side, it would be a business judgment on how off you were and how it may have affected the filings and so forth.
Okay, so our time is up, and I want to thank everyone for attending, and I want to thank you, Bob, for this great information. It is very helpful. It's a very complicated subject, and so I appreciate your willingness to take the time to share that with us. In addition, we have a resources page that you should see on your screen right now that has some additional resources, some of the resources that Bob mentioned. So there's a link on this slide as well as a QR code that you can click to follow up to get to that page. So please check out that resources page. Please check out the Shipping Solutions YouTube channel where it's also listed on this slide. We have now published a couple hundred short videos that discuss the basics of exporting and importing on this channel, and it is quickly growing in popularity. So check it out, and if you like what you see, please subscribe to that channel. Again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you very much, Bob, for your excellent presentation, and keep your eye open for follow-up to this webinar and our upcoming webinars as well. Stay well, everyone.